Chapter 1 Altdorf. Stewards dressed in rich doublets of crimson, their black boots polished to reflective shine, hurried about the grand hall. Some circled the richly carved table of dark Drackwald oak, which dominated the room, filling goblets and replacing victuals as the need arose. Others laboured to tend the three blazing hearths which opened upon the room, stuffing logs into the extravagantly sculpted moors of the fireplaces. Still other stewards, heavy black cloaks thrown about their shoulders, stood beside the mammoth picture window which stretched the length of the hall's western approach. The cloaked servants each held a long pole tipped with ostrich plumes, employing the curious tools to fan smoke from the fires through the small vents set just above the frosted panes of glass. The men situated about the great table paid no notice to the stewards, taking it for granted that an empty plate would soon have a sliver of cold venison upon it, and an empty goblet would be refilled with dusky solent wine. Upon the dais, situated at the far end of the hall, however, sat one who gave more of a passing notice to the stewards, particularly those about the Kaiserragen, that vast window which offered such a magnificent view of the river Reich, and an ancient city nestled against its banks. The window was a masterpiece, crafted by the finest glaziers gold could buy, dwarf craft, for only the doughty folk from under the mountains could create such astounding artistry. Glass itself was an expensive luxury only the temples and the wealthiest nobility could afford. Something of the scale of the picture window could have bankrupted any single province. Only the emperor could afford such indulgence. Gazing upon the window, Boris could almost feel the magic of the dwarves rushing through his bones. It was something an effort to remove his attention from the window and look past it upon the stunning vista beyond. The mighty span of the Reich, the greatest river in the world, and the opulence of Altdorf, the greatest city in the world, it sent another thrill coursing through his bones when he considered the river and the city. More than the opulence of the hall, the finery worn by servants and courtiers, the husky aromas of Tyrian perfumes and Arabian spices, the sweet melodies of silver-string lyres, and the cool feet of velvet cushions. More than any of these, the sight of the Reich and Altdorf spoke to him of wealth and power. His wealth. His power. If those churls allowed so much as a single smudge of soot to defile the Kaiserragen, he would have each of them discharged and lashed to a ducking-stool, hounded through the streets of Altdorf. The swine could try their hand at farming or starving. The Emperor's brow knotted in puzzlement at the last thought. He raised a bejewelled hand to his chin and scratched his thick black beard. Why should he care if discharged servants should starve? They were no concern of his. Still puzzled, he turned his eyes away from the distracting vista, and returned his attention to the irritating babble rising from around the oak table. The men seated about the table wore accoutrements to match the richness of their surroundings. There was a king's ransom on display, a riot of blackwork and brocade, exotic calico and fustian, silver-threaded gippons, and bellyfuls crafted from the most lustrous gold. Count von Suckelhoff, envoy of the Westerland court, sported a lavish cloak trimmed in seal fur and embroidered with fish and ships in cloth of gold. Baron von Clausewitz of Stirland wore a stylish tunic of russet, its sleeves broken by scalloped slashes to expose the fine material of the shirt beneath. There were, of course, exceptions. No amount of finery, for instance, could make Chief Elder Aldo Broadfellow look anything but ridiculous. The halfling's efforts to ape the styles of the imperial court only made him look even more the buffoon. Though, at least, the portly rodent had the good sense to keep his mouth shut, and not draw further attention to his foolishness. The same could be said for Baron Fornig of Middenheim. Even in the imperial court, the fellow affected the barbarous appearance of a half-civilized Teutogen, his shoulders draped with the snarling pelt of a white wolf, his hair and beard long and worn in the wildest state. The affectation of the backwoods savage was one designed to deliberately provoke the rest of the court, an effort to remind the rest of the empire that the city of the White Wolf, full to brimming with wild warriors, chomping at the bit to rush into battle once more. It might do to remind Middenheim of her less than sterling record upon the battlefield in the most recent violence to disrupt the empire. For all their vaunted prowess, for their supposed woodcraft, the soldiers of Middenheim and Middenland had proven incapable of crushing the latest uprising of beastmen in the Drakwold. Perhaps old Ulrich, god of walls and war, had been caught napping. A scowl flickered across the Emperor's lean features. His eyes turned towards the foot of the table, where sat a bald-headed man dressed in a black robe, trimmed in crimson, a golden hammer embroidered upon the breast. Arch-Lector Wolfgang Hartwich, representing Grand Theogonist Forgrad and the Temple of Sigmar. Since the Sigmarites had relocated their headquarters of their faith to Altdorf, after the fire that had destroyed the great cathedral at Nuln, and claimed the life of the old Grand Theogonist, their presence in the capital had become increasingly prominent and intrusive. The Arch-Lector was an insufferable annoyance, fairly exuding disapproval with his every glance and gesture. If Ulrich could be caught asleep, it seemed Sigmar was infuriatingly vigilant, his clergy only too ready to insinuate themselves into matters which were none of their concern. Emperor Boris tapped the gilded arms of his throne, pondering the question of Sigmar and his temple. He knew the Sigmarite faith was stronger in the south than in his native Drakwold, fairly eclipsing the worship of other gods when it came to Altdorf and the Reichland. The Grand Theogonist was the most powerful priest in the Empire, the pretensions of our Ulrich notwithstanding. Worse, the Temple of Sigmar had a structure and organization beyond any other faith. They could use that organization to disrupt production and trade as effectively as any goblin invasion or beastman uprising. Even an emperor had to treat them with deference and care, lest he offend the temple and the thousands of zealots who placed devotion to Sigmar above their duty to the sovereign. But it remains to be determined how serious the menace is. Emperor Boris shifted in his throne, focusing on the gaunt, cadaverous figure of Palatine Mikhail Kretzelescu, the envoy from the court of Count Malbork von Drac, voivod of Sylvania, had risen from his seat in order to address the assembled dignitaries. Count Malbork was, ostensibly, the vassal of Grand Count von Borcheslager of Stirland. Von Drac had purchased his title for a hefty contribution to the imperial treasury, and made little secret of his ambitions to make Sylvania an independent province in its own right. With tacit engagement from the Altdorf, von Drac had become too powerful for the Grand Count to simply remove. Stirland had to endure the voivod's talk of an independent Sylvania, while trying to counter von Drac's bribes in order to ensure the Emperor didn't grant territory its freedom. The Palatine's presence among the council was a vivid reminder to Baron von Clausewitz that Stirland had much to lose should its beneficence to the imperial treasury falter. A sycophant, renowned for his oratory, Kretzelescu's resonant voice would wax elegant for hours unless stifled by a higher authority. "Sylvania will pay its portion," Emperor Boris said in his deep, caustic tones, smothering Kretzelescu's words. "Every province in the land has a responsibility to protect her neighbors. Sylvania is no different. Von Drac will have to pay his share." Kretzelescu turned and bowed before the imperial throne. "But your imperial majesty, you have issued a diktat disbanding the army of the Drakwold. Surely there is no further—" "The beastmen continue to raid and maraud throughout the province," snarled Duke Conrad Aldrich. The young nobleman's face trembled with emotion, his eyes glistening with the simmering fires of hate. "It will take many soldiers to run the creatures to ground and wipe out their blot forever." "More soldiers than is practical, I fear," stated Count von Sockelhoff. "You cannot expect the rest of the Empire to beggar itself trying to rebuild a backwards frontier. No sane man would try to settle in the first place. I should think removing the Norskins from the Westerland would be of greater importance to the Empire." Von Sockelhoff's face went pale, even as the outburst left his lips. Timidly, he turned towards the enthroned Emperor Boris, belatedly remembering that his Imperial Majesty was originally from the Drakwold, and that Duke Conrad was also of the Hohenbachs. Fortunately for the Westerlander, the Emperor was of too practical a mindset to allow loyalty to his family and homeland to interrupt the prosperity of the Empire. "We all appreciate the suffering of Drakwold. The loss of Count Wilner is a pain that has touched us deeply. But this is not the time that we can allow emotion to rule above sense. We must look after the Empire as a whole. not allow the plight of any single province to weaken the others. Duke Conrad kept his face impassive, but his fist tightened about the stem of the goblet he held. Your Imperial Majesty, the Drakwold is in ruins. The foul beastmen have burned and pillaged a third of the province, but at least some damn little to destroy. Laughed the porcine Count Arthur of Nuln. He wiped his greasy fingers on the embroidered tablecloth and fixed his piggish eyes on the fuming Duke. Of course, if you'd like to arrange a loan, I'm sure we can come to terms. Before Duke Conrad could hurl his goblet into the chuckling Arthur's face, the man seated above his right rose from his chair. He was a short, stocky man, somehow maintaining a wiry build, his jaw firm, his blue eyes possessed of a piercing clarity. His vestments were subdued, beside the flamboyance of other noblemen, consisting of a tan-hued tunic and dark breeches. About his neck, however, he wore heavy gold pectoral of the Reichsmarschall, Baron Eberhard Johannes Bockeford, the Reichland's most famous soldier and commander of the Empire's armies. His promotion to Reichsmarschall had been something of a scandal. Never before had so young a soldier been elevated to such a position of authority, yet even the worst critics of Emperor Boris admitted that the controversial decision had been one of the few moments of genius displayed by His Imperial Majesty. Bockeford had led the Empire armies to victories against orc invasions in Averland and Solland, crushed a horde of goblins in Talabecland, and defended the shores of Nordland against the longships of High King Ormsgard of Norska. In the latest war, he had taken personal command of the campaign against the warherds of Kargor Deathhoof. It had been the Reichsmarschall who could conceive the elaborate trap which had lured Kargor from the protection of the forest into the pastureland around the ruined village of Kriegfels. He had ridden with the knights who charged the warherd and avenged Count Vilna by taking Kargor's head. There was no man in the great hall who commanded more respect than the Reichsmarschall. When he laid a restraining hand upon Duke Conrad's shoulder, the young nobleman's face flushed with shame at his lack of control. The Reichsmarschall turned his gaze to the throne, looking eyes at the Emperor before speaking. The soldier's jaw tightened. There was no need for Emperor Boris to remind him what was expected of him. One look into the coldest gaze of the seated sovereign made it clear. The warherds have been broken, Bockeford said. What are left are small packs of scavengers that pose no threat to any sizable settlement. The towns of southern Drakwold have nothing to fear from them. It is the logging camps and cattle ranches in the north that are imperiled. So you're saying the Drakwold still need protecting? The bearded Baron Fornig asked. Was it not by your suggestion that the army of Drakwold was disbanded? Count Ulfa quickly pointed out. The army of Drakwold had been hastily assembled from the contingents drawn from across the Empire. Crossbowmen from Wissenland, spearmen from Ostland, horsemen from Averland, swordsmen from Reichland, knights from the Ostermark and Middenheim. Now those contingents were already marching back to their homelands. Smashing the great warherds was a work for an army, Bockeford stated. What is left is a different kind of thing altogether. It will require time for Drakwold to heal her wounds, Emperor Boris declared. He motioned for Bockeford to be seated. We have spent enough blood and treasure crushing the monsters. We will spend no more. The beastmen are ruinous things. Without their leader, they will break apart now. Scatter back to the forest. He turned his gaze upon the Kaiseraugen, watching the autumn leaves drifting down the slanted rooftops of his city. The brutes will seek their lairs once winter is upon us. Ulrich's howl. He grinned at the use of the old euphemism for winter wind. We'll fit out their numbers, and come the spring, there won't be enough of them to threaten the Mootlands bawdy house. The jest brought expected laughter from the assembled dignitaries. Chief Elder Aldo Broadfellow cackled like a hyena, though his amusement didn't seem to reach his eyes. Then why don't we redirect our armies northwards to Westerland? Asked Baron Detlef von Slomberg. The knight was an older man. His long moustache faded to almost pure white, his head nearly as barren as the shell of an egg, but the physique beneath his black doublet remained a powerful one, and there was a sharpness in his gaze that bespoke the keenness of his mind. As the Grand Master of Reichenegg, he owed his loyalty to the Emperor, but he owed his position to Signan Holzwig, Prince of Altdorf. The suggestion was quickly caught up by Baron Solzwiedel. That makes sense, your Imperial Majesty, the Nordlander exclaimed. If the Beastman posed no serious threat, then the army should be sent to deal with the barbarians and avenge the outrage of Ormsgard upon our people. Ormsgard is dead, snarled Duke Conrad. Or were you too drunk to see his head spitted up pike on your way here? Count von Suckelhoff glared at the Drackwalder. Ormsgard and his fleet may be gone, but he left a son and hundreds of blood-crazed marauders behind. Do you know that Norscan animal is calling himself the Jarl of Vestland? They've occupied almost the whole of Marienburg. Better to lose a single city than to lose an entire province, Duke Conrad shouted back. The beastkin have scattered my peasantry to the four corners of the empire, and slaughtered every steer and sheep they can find. Truly spoken, rose the thunderous voice of Baron Fornig. The beastkin are a blight that we've ignored for far too long. They've despoiled not just Drackwall, but Middenland as well. The bearded baron waved his goblet at the fuming Van Suckelhoff. As for the Snaga half-lows and his sea-wolves, they'll lose interest in your fishing village soon enough and head back to their homes. You said that last year, Van Suckelhoff hissed, and the Norskins are still occupying my city. They burned down the Tempelvik and built a fort in the ruins of Winkelmarkt. He turned his ire back upon Duke Conrad, wagging his finger at the nobleman. And don't think we aren't aware of how Drackwalders have been thriving off our suffering. With Marienburg in the hands of barbarians, the river trade has been stopping at Karaberg and filling your coffers with taxes and tariffs. I shouldn't be surprised if you paid Snagger half-nose to your Sackhouse city. Maybe you should pay the Norskins to get rid of the beastman, quipped Count Arthur, making no effort to hide his enjoyment of watching the argument. Enough! The shout came from a hitherto silent man positioned at the end of the table. He was lean, sturdily built man with piercing blue eyes and close-cropped blonde hair. His vestments wore a fashionable cut, but a simple material, the rings on his fingers boasting fine craftsmanship, but unadorned by jewels and displays on the hand of the assembled nobility. The attention of dignitaries turned towards the blue-eyed man. Count von Suckelhoff and several of the others made no effort to keep the scorn off their faces. Tradition allowed for members of the clergy to be treated as belonging to an equal station, and the capricious decree of Emperor Ludwig the Fat forced them to accept the Elder of Mootland as their contemporary. There was no precedent forcing them to treat Aldolf Kreisig as anything but beneath their station. Kreisig was a peasant, a low-born ruffian, who had managed to work his way into the graces of Emperor Boris and become commander of the Kaiserjäger. The Kaiserjäger had originally been nothing more than woodsmen who organized hunts for the sovereign and his guests. Under Kreisig's leadership, however, their powers and responsibilities had been expanded. The Kaiserjäger had become the private constabulary of the Emperor Boris, the secret police of Altdorf. Whatever his position, Kreisig was still a mere peasant, and that was enough for some in the room to dismiss him entirely, to suffer his presence at the table, even if a custom dictated that he remain standing while his betters sat, was a vexation many of the nobles found difficult to ignore. For Kreisig to have the impertinence to shout down the two scions of the Empire was beyond an outrage. You forget your tongue, churl, growled Baron Fornig, his hand dropping to where he would have worn his sword had such a weapon been allowed in the imperial presence. I mean no disrespect, my lord, Kreisig said, bowing to the Middenheimer. However, it ill becomes the decorum of the assembly for two noble peers of the Empire to make such hurtful and foundless accusations against one another. Kreisig turned to regard Duke Conrad and Count von Suckelhoff in turn. Your Grace, I beg your indulgence if I have spoken out of turn. However, I am thinking only of the unity and fellowship of our nation. Arguing over the army of the Drackwald is useless at any event, Reichsmarshal Bockenwald said. The soldiers have been disbanded and are returning to their homes. Again he shot a glance towards Emperor Boris. The soldiers have been mustered out, Boris declared. Even those who must return to Ostend and Averland should be home in time for the harvest. He waved a bejeweled hand, motioning for the stoop-shouldered man seated near the head of the table to speak. Lord Ratomir stood adjusting his spectacles perched upon his hawkish nose, and started to read from a vellum scroll. A sickly pallor spread among the dissembled dignitaries. In 40 years, none of them had ever looked forward to anything the Imperial Minister of Finance had to say. Be it here decreed, on this day, the 12th of Nachelheim, Lord Ratimir began. Just cut the pleasantries and tell us how much it will cost us, growled Count Alta, all joviality absent now from his rotund face. Lord Ratimir grumbled, folding his scroll in his hands. There will be a new war tax levied upon each able-bodied peasant, 1 shilling for all those aged between 10 and 50, 1 half-shilling for all those aged beyond the age of 50 and under the age of 10. The declaration brought protests from every quarter, the room descending into bedlam of commotion. You can't expect us to pay this, shouted Baron von Clausewitz. The imperial levies on commerce are already straining the resources of our fields and farms. For every shilling that comes out of the ground, Altdorf is already taking 5 pfennigs. Emperor Boris rose from his throne, smashing his goblet to the floor. Then you have to manage your resources better. He smacked his hand against the chest. We are responsible for defending the sacred empire bestowed upon mankind by the holy Sigmar himself. That is not a responsibility we will suffer lightly, and we will not allow any of our subjects to ignore their responsibility either. Boris turned his head, motioning to Lord Ratimir. To guide you in your obligations, I have made an additional decree. Lord Ratimir unrolled the scroll and cleared his throat. Let it be herewith noted that there shall no longer be granted an exclusion for the class of peasantry known as Dienstlut. The statement provoked an even louder expression of outrage from the nobleman. You cannot be serious, roared Baron Fornig. Mindenheim alone keeps 2,000 Dienstlut to defend Ulrichsburg and the forests around her. And why do you need so many soldiers to defend your city? Emperor Boris challenged. The beastkin have left your forest to ravage the Drakwold. What of Nuln, where there hasn't been violence in 100 years? Count Arthur has nearly 4,000 Dienstlut, many of whom have probably never even held a sword. No, I shall not suffer the imperial treasury to be impoverished by greedy nobles trying to aggrandize their personal fortunes by declaring half of their peasantry a Dienstman. We can't possibly afford to pay our soldiers as well as our serfs, protested Grand Duke Bela, Count of Talabecland. Then don't retain them as soldiers, Count Ratimir suggested. Put them to work in the fields, increase the harvest and your yield. Every man who takes up a sword that doesn't take up the plough is a drain on resources rather than a creator of wealth. Many of these men know no trade but the sword, objected Bockenford. The Emperor gave the general a warning look. But the warning went unheeded this time. The fathers of many men were soldiers, as were their fathers, before them. These men wouldn't know one end of a plough from the other. It should be an easy choice, then, for the masters of such wastrels to discharge them from their service, Lord Ratimir said. Several of the assembled nobles looked appalled at the suggestion. Where would these discharged Dienstlut go? What would they do? Demanded Baron von Schlomberg. Work or starve, was the Emperor's cold answer. Beilerhof. Temple bells rang through the town's muddy streets, a doleful peal echoed over the thatched roofs and far out across the fields and marshes beyond Beilerhof. In this time of calamity, it did not matter if the bells rested within the temple of Shalia or more. All the town's religions were united by a common purpose and the edicts of Baron von Rittendahl, the prefect of Beilerhof. The bells were to sound from dawn until noon, warning the peasants that the corpse collectors were making their rounds. It was time for the healthy people to shun the streets and keep behind locked doors, praying to the gods for deliverance from the evil stalking Sylvania. It was a time for those whose household had been reduced by the plague to leave the remains out upon the doorstep for the collectors to bear away. Few people dared venture upon the streets of Beilerhof while the bells tolled. Even the Baron's soldiers kept inside their towers at such times. Abhorrence of the dead was instinctual in all men, but the fear was magnified if death was brought by some strange and unknown cause. The plague was something new to Sylvania, something unknown in a land of green hills and dense forests. The people cowered before the malignant disease, seeing it as a horror inflicted upon them by supernatural powers. As he strode the empty streets, the priest felt the weight of his office like a great stone tied about his neck. His heart cracked a little more each time he passed a body lying strewn across someone's threshold. His eyes misted with pity when he saw the ugly red crosses daubed upon mud-brick walls, marking another home where the plague had struck. He shared in the frustration of the peasants when he saw crude corn doll effigies lying half-burnt in the mud, or the carcass of shaved cats nailed above a threshold. In their terror, the people turned to every superstition recalled by their foreknown ancestry, evoking any kind of magic to combat the forces of old night. Many of the dead lying in the street had ropes tied about their necks, marking them as offerings to Bailarak, the ancient marsh god, whose worship persisted even in the face of kinder, more enlightened gods. These bodies would not get taken to the gardens of Moor, but to the quagmire of Bailahoff Marsh, consigned to the muddy deep and the keeping of the god who dwelled there. The priest smiled sadly as he watched the hay cart come trundling down the lane, bodies piled in its bed like cordwood. He watched it stop outside a mud-brick hut and observed as the men pulling the cart set the yoke down and started lifting corpses from the street. They took no especial precautions, these collectors of the dead, and their wasted frames wore the same woolen breeches and jackets as any peasant. Only the black caps crunched down upon their ears denoted their occupation, the hollow, sunken faces that stared out from beneath their hats. There were no need for precautions, not for these men. In the minds of friends and family, the corpse collectors were already dead. They were another reason why the streets were empty when the bells tolled. The men who dragged the cart through Bailahoff were already infected by the plague. The men loaded up their grisly burden into the cart. The plague left little of its victims, withering them into desiccated husks. Even for the sickly collectors, it took no great effort to carry their macabre cargo. There were 20 or 30 bodies in the cart this morning. The collectors were still equal to the task of dragging it down the street in search of more bodies. After a bad night, they might make 10 trips between the town and the marsh. The priest hoped it hadn't been a bad night. Making the sign of Moor as he passed the cart, invoking the protection of his god, for the souls of the dead, the priest proceeded through the deserted town, his black robes whipping about him in the crisp autumn breeze. The breeze brought the stink of the marsh slithering through Bailahoff, a smell which ordinarily is unwelcome as a goblin, but which was now considered far more wholesome than the reek of the unburied dead. The priest, a servant of the god of death, was accustomed to the smell of corpses, but he shared the sentiments of the townsfolk. There was nothing wholesome about this plague, and anything that would oppose it should be welcomed. The priest rounded a corner, noting with some misgiving the gnarled oak standing in the square ahead. A horrible crime had employed the tree as its centrepiece. In their terror of the plague, the townsfolk were ready to embrace any rumour or superstition. An old wise tale about dwarfs being able to curse men with hairs from their beards had provoked a mob into lynching the 3 dwarf smiths residing at Bailahoff Castle. The crime had outraged Baron von Rittendahl, and in his anger he appealed to Count Malbork von Drac for aid. A second tragedy had resulted from the unwise decision. Too disinterested to uncover the perpetrators, von Drac ordered 20 peasants chosen at random and flayed alive, their skins sent to one of the dwarf holts high in the mountains. It had fallen to the priests of Moor to attend and bury the von Drac's men left behind. One of the dead had been a little girl, not more than 12 winters old. The von Dracs were infamous for their cruelty, and the thought of Sylvania that might break away entirely from Stirland, with Count Malbork as its voivode, was one that kept many people awake at night. The priest hurried past a hanging tree, turning his thoughts away from lynchings and tyrants, even from plague and bells. It was Angerstag, and that meant he would break his fast with family. It was a ritual as old as his own childhood, the son of the sea captain in the great city of Marienburg. With so many of the family scattered all over the city or away on ships, it had been a strictly obeyed tradition among them that on Angerstag, as many of the family as could gather together for breakfast. The priest stopped as he reached a narrow lane bordered on the side of a workyard of a cartwright, and on the other side the stone walls of a granary. Further down the street rose a huddle of tall timber houses, the homes of Beilerhof's more prosperous tradesmen and burghers. It was to one of these homes the priest's path led. He smiled as he looked up at the threshold of his brother's home. No shaved cat nailed upon the door, or appeal to ancient gods chalked upon the wall. Only a simple iron fish tacked to the door itself, an old Marienburger custom meant to promote good fortune. After his first knock, the door was tugged open, and an exuberant boy with blond hair and deep blue eyes grinned up at the priest. "Uncle Frederick!" The boy hailed him, then turned around to shout the news to the rest of the household. "Papa, Mama, Uncle Frederick is here!" The priest stepped inside, setting his staff in a vase just within the entranceway. He turned and made the sign of more, a gesture meant to keep any wayward spirits from slipping into the house alongside him. It was always good to be careful where restless ghosts were concerned, especially in such times as these. "The prodigal brother returns!" A tall, clean-cut man came striding through the door, his face split in a broad smile. He bowed his head in respectful recognition of the priest's rank, before taking a brotherly jab at Frederick's shoulder. "It was wrong to scold him, Rutger," a soft voice admonished the tall man. The speaker was a young woman, her golden tresses bound by a headscarf in the Sylvanian fashion, her slender figure pressed into a fashionable cotehardie gown after the Marienburg manner. Her pretty features formed a welcoming smile as she extended her hand to the priest. "With what is happening in Beilerhof, a priest and more must have much to do." Frederick bowed, kissing the woman's hand. "I'm sorry I brought you here, Aisha," he apologized. "This is a poor place," Rutger scowled at his brother. "If we'd stayed in Marienburg, we'd have been carved up by Snugger Half-Nose by now. I'm only sorry more of the family didn't leave when they had the chance." He smiled and reached to his neck, drawing out a brass pomander fitted to his chin. As did so, his wife and son followed suit, displaying their own pomanders. "See, we're all protected against the plague. A lot easier than to dodge a Norskin's axe." The priest couldn't share in his brother's jest. He buried too many people with posies in their pockets and pomanders about their necks to believe bad air was the source of the plague, and that the strong fragrance could protect against the disease. "I still feel responsible. If you'd gone to Outland or Wurtbad, there would have been no one there to help welcome us and help us make a home," stated Aisha. "And from what I hear, the plague is there too," Rutger said. He frowned a little as he looked down at his son. He reached over at the tousled boy's hair. "I think we should save this discussion for another time. As my wife points out, you're a busy man." A smile returned to Rutger's face as he led the priest into his home. "Who knows when brothers Van Hal will have another chance to break their fast together?" Nuln. Dead leaves crinkled between Walter Schill's boots as he picked his way through the dark streets. The flickering glow of the rushlight he carried was just enough to reveal the half-timbered buildings squatting to either side of the narrowed lane. This was an old part of Nuln, dating from the city's infancy, when it was just a little trading town nestled in the marshland where the River Reich joined the River Ava. The plaster walls rose from the thick stone foundation walls, relics of the roundhouses of ancient Merogan fishermen. The combination gave the structures a peculiar appearance, with curving ground floors of heavy limestone and clay supporting timber upper stories, which were sharply angular. In more prosperous sections of the city, the building had a more harmonious appearance, but no one in the Freiburg district had the resources to rebuild. Those few that did had already removed themselves to wealthy Alderstadt across the river, or the growing sprawl of Handelsbezirk, south of Universität. A warm breeze whistled through the deserted streets, except for a pair of dung-gatherers. Walter was alone. Any decent folk, common wisdom claimed, should be abed at such an unseemly hour. The powers of old night, the wise said, were at their most malignant just before the dawn, and the rising sun forced them to back into their netherworld lairs. Walter scoffed at such old superstitions. He'd never seen evidence of old night or the ruinous powers, any proof of vampires and werewolves prowling the countryside, seeking whom they might devour, or malevolent warlocks biding their time until they could use their magic to change the unwary into snakes and toads. He relegated such talk to nursery nonsense, like the black boar and the underfolk fairy tales meant to frighten small children into behaving. Walter shifted the heavy linen sack slung across his shoulders, smiling at the weight of his burden. All his life he had laboured in the dark, making his living during those cursed hours when other men slept. A hunter had to abide by the nature of his prey. The creature was one of darkness, and he had to become a creature of darkness himself. It was as simple as that. Even Verena would concede the logic of such a conclusion. As he strode past the dung-gatherers in their grubby woolen hoods, one of them looked up at Walter, wrinkling his nose and making an expression of distaste. Walter glowered at the grimy man, shifting his step so he could kick loose a stone at the muckraker. "I'll make more tonight than you'll see all month," he grumbled at the dung-gatherer. "At least it's clean work," the hooded man snarled, wiping refuse from his back with his hand on a strip of soiled felt. Walter scowled at the dung-gatherer and marched on. What did the scum know? In a few more weeks the fellow would be begging for pennies and picking eggshells from the gutter. The harvest was in. No one would want manure for their fields until spring. The muckraker would be reduced to surviving on pittance. Count Arthur paid to keep the streets clean in the best of times. That would be just enough to allow a man to starve his way through the winter, allowing he didn't have a family to support. And these were anything but best of times. By contrast, there was always a demand for Walter and his profession. The very repugnance with which the dung-gatherers regarded his trade ensured that they would always be work for a rat-catcher. It had always puzzled Walter why most people looked upon rats with such fear and loathing. Certainly they were noxious little pests, but hardly things to evoke horror. Still, if people wanted to be stupid and afraid, Walter was quite happy to exploit them. 5 rat-tails would bring a bounty of 2 pennies from the city coffers, as much as a dung-gatherer would be paid for an entire week of shovelling the streets. The rat-catcher cast a backwards glance at the hooded men and their little cart filled with dung. They'd be hard-pressed selling the night soil this time of year. No farmer would need manure now. It was possible they might be able to sell some of it as fuel, but only the poorest of the poor in the shanty town, besides the South Docks, would resort to such measures. Hardly the most wealthy clientele. Again, Walter reflected upon the benefits of being a hunter. In addition to the bounty offered by the Burgermeister, there was always a market for his catch. From out the darkness a battered wooden sign swayed upon rusty iron chains. There was no lettering upon the board. Few in this part of the city were literate, but the painted image of a hog's head did a serviceable job of proclaiming the sort of business housed within. Walter shifted the heavy sack from one shoulder to the other. Using the haft of the pole he employed in his work, he knocked against the door. It was a few minutes before the door was tugged open. A balding, overweight man, dressed only in his nightshirt, stood blinking in the doorway, a foul-smelling candle clenched in his fist. He stared bleary-eyed at Walter. The rat-catcher knew he must present quite a sight, his wool garments caked in the filth of Noln's sewers, his hands stained with blood, his face drawn and haggard from the long night of crawling after rodents. "Are you going to let me in?" Walter said, his tone gruff and impatient. "Shill," the fat man said, stepping aside to allow the rat-catcher entry. "I've told you before to come by the back way," the man grumbled as he closed the door behind his visitor. "I'm in too much of an hurry," Walter told him, blowing out the rushlight and stuffing the remains of the taper into a cowhide holster. "Hunting was good tonight. I lost track of time." He strode through the little shop, around bins of pig feet and goat ears, past racks of ham hocks and the plucked carcasses of chickens. With a sigh of relief, the rat-catcher set his bag down on the wooden counter at the back of the shop. "In an hurry?" The fat man scowled, coming around the counter. He set the candle down beside a pair of bronze scales. Fumbling about behind the counter, he produced a number of tiny stone weights. "You mean you've been dry too long?" He reached over and to untie the twine closing the bag. "You should talk Bremer into making you a partner, with all the money you drop at Black Rose." Walter's eyes narrowed with annoyance. Angrily, he drew the bag away. "I don't go there to see Bremer. I don't come here to be lectured, Osman." "Have it as you want," Osman apologised. "Let's see what you have." The butcher reached into the linen bag, removing the long furry body of a rat. He jostled the dead rodent for a moment in his hand, trying to estimate its weight, before resorting to the scales. "A big one. Might be 16 ounces. He cast a glance at the bulky bag. "Are they all like that?" Walter nodded. "I said the hunting was good. 43 longtails and not a runt among them. Osman made an appreciative whistle, sliding the first rat over to the scales. I'm afraid I can't give you much coin, he said. There's not too much demand for dog fodder. You'll pay what you always pay, Walter told him. Reaching for the bag, Osman quickly laid a protective hand atop it. The rat catcher drew back, waving his hand at the empty meat hooks hanging from the ceiling, and the empty bins lined against the wall. I'm well aware of what you need. This talk of plague has made the burghers nervous. Count Arthur has outlawed the transport of cattle from Stirling to try and keep it from spreading into Nuln. The guildmasters are sure that they can buy enough Reichland beef to make up for it, but one look at your shells makes me think otherwise. The burghers might be peasants, but they ain't serfs. They want some meat with their supper. The butcher drew back his face aghast. Surely you aren't suggesting. I might do more than suggest, the rat catcher threatened. Osman licked his lips nervously. He began drawing raps from the bag, setting each in turn on the scales, scribbling figures on a scrap of sackcloth. Care for something to eat while I tally this up? Some sausage? Walter gave the man a crooked smile. Osman, just because I catch them doesn't mean I want to eat them.